Welcome to On Contact. Today we discuss the book Ghost Riders of Baghdad with Danny Sjursen, a combat veteran and West Point graduate.
We talk a lot about moral courage at West Point. It's a term they throw around, but they've largely hijacked it. It is much harder in a lot of ways to speak out against the tide. And obviously you've done that for your entire career, and there are real costs, emotional, professional, and it's a difficult thing. And I think that the fact that it's so rare, I mean, name 5 generals who've spoken out publicly against these wars, even in retirement, and you'd be hard pressed. It's a difficult thing, but I think that it's worth the cost because it would truly be obscene not to. And so at the risk of sounding self-righteous, I feel like this right now is more than just lapsed Catholic penance. This is sort of the most important duty I think I've ever done for my nation. And it's funny that when you do that sort of work, you're quickly labeled as anti-nation, anti-American.
Those who know war detest the empty jingoism, the abstract words of glory, honor, and patriotism, used to mask the cries of the wounded, the senseless killing, war profiteering, and chest-pounding grief. They know the lies the generals and politicians do not acknowledge, the lies covered up in stately war memorials and mythic war narratives, filled with stories of courage and comradeship. They know the lies that permeate the thick, self-important memoirs by amoral statesmen and generals who make wars but do not know war. They know that war is a state of almost pure sin, with its goals of hatred and destruction. They know how war fosters alienation, leads inevitably to nihilism, and is a turning away from the sanctity and preservation of life. All other narratives about war too easily fall prey to the allure and seductiveness of violence, as well as the attraction of the godlike power that comes with a license to kill with impunity. But the truth about war always comes out too late, when those maimed by war unpack their suffering, what it was like to taste death, to watch the good and the innocent die. And by then few listen. We are assured by the war makers with each new military adventure that these stories have no bearing on the glorious violent enterprise the nation is about to inaugurate. And lapping up the myth of war and its sense of empowerment, we, the public, prefer not to look. Danny Sjursen, a graduate of West Point, an Army major who did combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, in his book, Ghost Riders of Baghdad, struggles like so many who come home burdened by the hammer blows of war, to speak an unpleasant truth we ignore at our peril. He joins me from his home in Kansas. So, Danny, I once read an Army study that said that people who experience combat suffer the same kind of emotional trauma as someone who has a car accident in which their best friend is killed. Would you say that's an accurate description of what it's like to go through combat?
Yeah, to a large extent it is, for a couple of reasons. One, there's the obvious survivor's guilt issue. It's a platitude now, but why am I home in Colorado Springs, when 4 members of the platoon are not, in my case? And then also there's the randomness of a car accident, the uncontrollable feeling, which I think drives some of that survivor's guilt. So yeah, absolutely. And folks respond to it differently. Some people just black out and go silent. Some people become more jingoistic in order to sort of justify what the heck we just lost these friends for. And then I think a minority of us just feel it's obscene to not question the war in general.
I want to talk a little bit about that because you write about it in the book. Your squad had, I think, 20 members? Very small. This was in Iraq. You were a first lieutenant. So you lose 2 to combat, killed, 1 very badly wounded, I think became a paraplegic, and 1 goes home on leave and kills himself, right? One of the members of the unit, I think after you come home, kills themselves. Is that correct? So, I mean, a very high percentage of people who are, even if it's by their own hand, destroyed by that war. And you write at length about, well, there was one particular soldier you were particularly close to. What is that guilt about? Because it's, what do you blame yourself? Obviously, in the book, you blamed yourself as the kind of the commander of the squad, but it's more than that.
Yeah, my initial response was to make it about me. I mean, some of that is utterly selfish and self-righteous. Just by the merits, what sort of happened was that, I was a platoon leader, like you mentioned. I had about 19 guys. We had 50% combat casualties, killed and wounded, plus the suicides. But on the particular night, January 25th, 2007, where a Shia militia had set off what supposedly is an Iranian-made EFP, I had kind of made what I felt were two mistakes, one rational, one a little more irrational. We made a bad turn and went down a street I didn't want to. And, I chose not to correct the sergeant leading in the first truck. I didn't want to undermine his authority. And I guess I just gambled that it would be fine, because it usually was. So that was a tactical error that I lived with. And then the other was that Alex Fuller, on my bracelet, probably the soldier I was closest to, from New Bedford, Massachusetts. I know you know that area fairly well. I had allowed him to leave my crew, and where he had been the gunner on the Humvee, and go and be a dismounted squad leader. So what that meant was he was in the front vehicle in front of me. So obviously he was killed. And you develop these narratives, and a lot of it's self-centered. I think I've let a lot of that go, partly through writing the book and the catharsis of that. But I think that in a general sense, there's still the guilt that, you were in command. Everything that happens is yours. But more than that, at a macro level, I had gone into the Iraq War still kind of a believer. And so I feel a guilt about having not been against that war from the start. And so I do feel complicit, like I think almost all Americans are, because this is done in our name, whether we admit it or not.
I lost my closest friend, Kurt Schork. I worked with him for 10 years in Iraq and Bosnia and Kosovo. He's killed in Sierra Leone in an ambush with another friend of mine. And I always felt that somehow one had to live for the dead in a way. That the guilt, I wasn't even in Sierra Leone when he was killed, but in some sense, they become these kind of phantom presences in your life. Is that your experience as well?
Absolutely. And I've gone through phases with this. I've handled it differently. I named my son after Alex, as well as James and Michael, who had also been killed. That was symbolic, but it's in some ways I have like a walking 11-year-old reminder there. And I've had dark times, dealt with, depression and some serious, some substance stuff. And, but I, in my better times, and I'm in a really good phase right now, I do think to myself that we have to live for those who just didn't get a chance.
How long did it take you before you realized the kind of fiasco that Iraq was after you were deployed?
Not long at all. It's funny you say fiasco, because my Lieutenant Colonel, Jimmy Phillips, had actually told us that he had just read Fiasco by Tom Ricks right before deployment, and even talked about it in Kuwait. So even he was having some doubts, tactical, more than strategic. By late November, which is only a month into leading my own patrols, I think the place that I was at was realizing that this was a civil war. General Casey and the Pentagon were lying about that, saying it wasn't. And I began to realize we can't win. And so my evolution started out, I'm embarrassed to say, by saying, well, we shouldn't be here because we can't win. This is a fiasco tactically and operationally. Only later, though, at the end of that war, and then especially into Afghanistan, did I start to say, we created this problem and shouldn't have been here in the first place. And then only later than that, after Afghanistan, was it, this is an empire, this is systemic, the warfare state is the problem. So I think, I was talking to Larry Wilkerson yesterday, and we described how we had a very similar trajectory. And I'm a little embarrassed of it.
He was cold. I just want to interrupt. He was a Vietnam veteran, Colin Powell's chief of staff.
That's right. And we talked about how he's 75 years old, I'm 36. We two different wars, and we were both sort of embarrassed by how long it took us to have the epiphany of such a thing exists. But it was gradual. It's a gradual thing.
What did you learn? I mean, you came out of West Point, the honor code, this long, venerating this long military tradition. Although I remember when I was at West Point seeing a portrait of Robert E. Lee in his Confederate uniform in the library, which kind of threw me. And so that experience where, it's almost the church of the military, that's different than just coming in as a kid from New Bedford. And so how much of a kind of existential clash was that for you?
It was a huge problem of identity to become sort of a dissenter. Coming out of West Point, it's a national sacred cow. I've found that of all my writing, some of the articles that have gotten me the most pushback and hate are anytime that I criticize West Point as an institution. And I think that is because it is a sort of a national treasure in a lot of people's minds. Leaving that behind and questioning it, I lost 50% of my friends and colleagues, and it was difficult personally, because if I'm not a soldier, what am I? Just two quick things that you mentioned. You mentioned the honor code. Of course, the class of '86 at West Point is infused in this administration, and Pompeo actually made a joke, Secretary of State Pompeo, about the honor code when he was at the CIA. He said, they taught us not to lie, cheat, or steal, but we do that every day in the CIA. And then a quick note on the Confederacy, which I think is relevant in this moment of protests against racial violence. I used to, when I taught at West Point in 2014 to 16, I would drive from Lee housing area or near Lee housing area down Lee Road past Lee Barracks on the way to my office to teach American history. That's true. That's right. That's all factual.
I want to talk about courage, because you talk about it in the book, and I thought it was a really good point, that courage is never a constant. This idea, first of all, we know that people who remain in combat for, this was especially studied in World War II, 25 days, the whole unit has a psychological breakdown. So the idea that everyone has a breaking point, but also it's uneven. Some days you go out and have courage, and some days you don't. And you do write quite honestly about that, using yourself as an example. Talk about that.
I think my misunderstanding was that there were brave people and there are cowards. And I don't know if the institution of West Point kind of built that into you, but maybe that's part of where it came from. But maybe it was just that I watched war movies my whole life. That's what I did, right? And Wild West films. That's part of why I ended up at West Point. In combat, what I found is that, while there's maybe a 10% minority that's just like always kind of shirking from combat, and maybe 10% that are straight adrenaline junkies, most of us were very halting and nonlinear and inconsistent in our behavior. So, there were times where I ran through bullets to, get to a wounded guy. I don't know what the heck I was really going to do there, because I'm not a medic. And then there were times that I largely kind of, hid behind my Humvee and tried to figure out what's the next move. And so some days you go home and you go back to your base and you reassess your actions. And I feel like you do an after action report, as we call it in the military, AAR, on your courage every day. And I really didn't forgive myself sometimes for my poor behavior in certain instances. And then other times, more than proud of myself, I was like wondering if I manufactured these memories. Did I really do that?
I'm going to pick up on that when we come back from our break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with combat veteran Danny Sjursen. Welcome back to On Contact. We continue our conversation with combat veteran Danny Sjursen. So let's pick up on courage, which, first of all, in combat, what you do is often instinctual. You don't have time to think about it. So I was in a situation in the Sudan where a bunch of soldiers, I was with my very close friend, a reporter from the Wall Street Journal. They clicked the safeties. It was at night, off their weapons, which meant they were getting ready to fire. And I instinctively, I'm ashamed of it, I was a couple of paces behind him. I instinctively stepped behind him so that here was a close friend of mine. So the bullets would go through his body first. And you can instinctually in combat, on the other end, carry out acts of supposedly heroism or courage, but I think we have to explore the nature of the combat high. First of all, you're terribly sleep deprived. You're pumped up on adrenaline. Oftentimes, I found that in combat situations, you can be very cavalier. I mean, even kind of laughing and joking in a bizarre, dangerous situation. And at least my experience was so much of that just seemed to be chemical. It certainly wasn't premeditated.
Absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned sort of the dark humor, dryness. I mean, it's incredible. Some of the I don't think I've ever heard funnier jokes from, you know, even Dave Chappelle that I've heard from, you know,
which is almost always sexual, by the way.
Right. Oh yeah, and sort of homoerotic, of course. I was always in male units only back then. Right. No, it was there's a dark humor. There's a sort of bravado of sarcasm that comes out. But you're right, a lot of it is chemical, and I think that Tim O'Brien, who writes fiction that's, you know, based on his own experience in Vietnam, talks a lot about the hazy nature of combat remembrances and the way that you almost seem to black out, and then you wonder what was real and what wasn't. I found that to be the case, and talking to my peers, mostly the other platoon leaders, we had like a moment where we were like, oh wow, you feel that too? Because I think a lot of us were a little almost embarrassed until we were able to discuss that. And you know, that was one of the things about, they talk camaraderie in combat, but it is real, even in illegal and unethical wars. It's a thing.
Well, the camaraderie is real. We had it among war correspondents. One of the things I miss. It's not friendship, as J. Glenn Gray points out in Warriors: Reflections on Men in Battle. It's something very different, and I think oftentimes veterans will try and recreate it when they have to get home, usually through alcohol, and it never works. All of these people that you are quite willing to risk your life for, who you think you've never had this kind of bond with before, once the external threat is gone and the bonding of the unit is gone, become strangers to you.
It's so true. You mentioned alcohol, and I'll just start there. I'm of the opinion that we actually trained. I mean, they're changing the culture a little now, but mostly on the veneer. We almost like trained for combat through drinking. I mean, every unit camaraderie event, they even called them that, right? Like camaraderie events involved like who can drink the most. And I was in the cavalry, right? Like light scouts. So we had these Stetson cavalry hats from the Indian Wars. We would like force the new lieutenants to drink everything out of them. And it was almost like pushing yourself to the limit before combat, almost to build that camaraderie. And then, of course, afterwards, it has even a darker flow. As for becoming strangers, it's really a difficult thing. I still visit, or some of my sergeants will visit me a couple times a year, and it's wonderful. And I think they'll be okay with me saying this. When they leave after a wild night, now I'm relieved in a way. Not because I don't love them, but because I don't know them and they don't know me, and there's something missing and we can't recreate it. And the journey to try is actually kind of harmful sometimes.
Exactly. Yeah. They're having a reunion for correspondents who covered the war in Sarajevo, but I won't go because I know it'll just be people drinking themselves into oblivion, trying to recreate something that can't be recaptured. I want to talk about the military. What in your whole trajectory? How many years were you in the military? It was was it 18 or it was a while, right? Total?
Yeah, just under 18 years, including my West Point time, which technically you're active duty there, unlike, you know, RTC right. Or something.
What did you learn about the military?
Well, I certainly learned two key things. First, one, loyalty is prized above anything else. They say it's to the institution, but oftentimes it's to something much smaller, an individual leader, an individual unit. Stepping outside the bounds of how they define loyalty, you will be smacked down, especially if you embarrass them, which is worse, actually, than being tactically incompetent. And that's an important point. I mean, truly, you will get in more trouble in the military, I've found, for speaking out of turn, saying the wrong thing to a reporter. Nobody wants journalists around them because they're afraid they'll be quoted and they'll get in trouble. That's a big deal. You can get soldiers killed through rank incompetence and still get promoted. That's okay. And then the second thing I learned is that the anti-intellectual bent in the military remains. And it was not meaningfully changed by the faux intellectuals who supposedly took over mid-Iraq war surge. And I'm talking about the Petraeuses and the McChrystals here. They did not meaningfully alter the anti-intellectual bent. These are not readers, largely, and they do not understand or really particularly care to understand, the majority, I mean, the countries that we, police, occupy, purport to secure.
Well, McChrystal and Petraeus, these are media creations, really, in terms of their public persona. And
well, it's really true.
I mean, a figure like Petraeus is, he's very adept at handling the bureaucracy and promoting himself, including within the press. But as you write in your book, the whole idea that he saved Iraq through the surge is a lie.
It's cosmetic. It was meant to be from the start. This is a guy who cultivated the media throughout his career. I mean, even as a captain, we're talking, and it wasn't just him. These guys thought they could use the media rather than the other way around. And they were fairly adept at it. And of course, most of the mainstream media played ball. And here's the thing that I think is interesting. Most media reporting of Petraeus and McChrystal in particular, because they led both wars, both surges, focused on character and anecdotal minutia rather than policy. What are these guys really selling America? Will their strategy work? Is it a strategy at all? Instead, you had all these stories about, oh, McChrystal is such an ascetic. He runs 10 miles every morning to the Council of Foreign Relations. That kind of reporting, actually, I thought was dangerous and misleading, because you're right, they were media creations, self-cultivated, especially in the case of Petraeus.
Well, and also the narrative that they spun out was not true.
And it was based on a misunderstanding of history. What they did is they cherry-picked these supposed success stories from counterinsurgencies, particularly the British models in like Malaya. And what they never did was two things. They never complicated it by showing why these individual cases might have been unique. And then they never took a broader political strategic narrative to show that in all of these cases, the ultimate outcomes politically, which supposedly is what matters in war, said, Clausewitz, politically, they didn't really pan out. So they just cherry picked this history. And that's what I call faux intellectualism. In fact, if you read Petraeus's Princeton dissertation on Vietnam, it's wildly wrong. And I'm not afraid to say that. And the consensus of Vietnam scholars would agree. It's nonsense and it's myth.
Let's talk a little bit about the wars themselves. We're pushing 2 decades now. I think by any metric, even within the military, they would have to say we've lost the war in Afghanistan. Iraq has been turned into a proxy state for Iran. Why do they continue? Why don't they stop?
This is a difficult question, and I don't pretend to have the perfect answer, because I'm left with that question as well. For example, nobody in the military that I know talks about victory anymore. They would laugh at you, even at the highest levels. No one even pretends that what we're doing is going to be ultimately successful. But that comes back to some of that loyalty stuff. So I think there's two forces at work. The military complies because it's what the military does. That's the culture, that's the code. To step outside of it is anathema. The second thing is that there are other interests, and they're not the sergeants from New Bedford. There are other interests who have a professional and a pecuniary benefit from these wars. And so I wrote a sort of a piece that I thought was instructive on the West Point class of '86, where I showed that these folks, whether they're at the top of the Pentagon, but most of them are like CEOs or working in DOD as civilians, they're profiting, again, not just with money, but also professionally from these wars. So the military-industrial complex is nebulous and cliched, but it is real. And I think it's much broader, because Eisenhower wanted to include the Congress. I would include the media, academia, and a number of other things. It is no accident that so many CEOs come out of these West Point classes, and a lot of them are even in big pharma, which you could look at and say, oh, that has nothing to do with the war. But I would disagree.
I mean, you write in the book, you ask, why is it that essentially junior officers, I don't know if a major is a junior officer, but why don't you have these generals getting up and speaking out on what they know, which is the kind of futility of these endless conflicts. But of course, once they finish the military, they go straight to Raytheon or Halliburton. And that's not in the book, but I wonder if that's one of the major reasons they just keep silent. It's not in their financial interest to stop this.
Well, the revolving door is also very real. When I wrote that Class of '86 article, I talked about how colonels and generals, in real cases, real people that I mentioned by name, they would leave, for example, an air defense artillery job where their job, at a high level was to deal with the Patriot missile system or the theater air defense. And then the next day, I mean, literally the next day after retirement, go work for Raytheon or Lockheed on those same programs. That's a big part of it. But I would say that it's important to understand that personal motivations often do go beyond just economic determinism, although I think that's big, because it's a culture and it's an identity you're giving up. These generals, they go live in retirement communities in Florida that are all generals. It's an actual thing that they socialize with other generals. They may even get a little bit of a media voice. And to give that up, to leave the crew, is a very difficult thing to do, because they're going to impugn your character if you do. And I know a little about that at a lower level.
I once visited a retirement community of CIA agents in Maine, of all places, a few hundred of them from all. But you're right, it is a culture, and it's a fraternity. And just to close, I saw a lot of physical courage in war, very, very little moral courage, which I think you display, which is much harder.
I agree with that. We talk a lot about moral courage at West Point. It's a term they throw around, but they've largely hijacked it. It is much harder in a lot of ways to speak out against the tide, and obviously you've done that for your entire career. And there are real costs, emotional, professional, and it's a difficult thing. And I think that the fact that it's so rare. I mean, name 5 generals who've spoken out publicly against these wars, even in retirement, and you'd be hard pressed. It's a difficult thing, but I think that it's worth the cost, because it would truly be obscene not to. And so, at the risk of sounding self-righteous, I feel like this right now is more than just lapsed Catholic penance. This is sort of the most important duty I think I've ever done for my nation. And it's funny that when you do that sort of work, you're quickly labeled as anti-nation, anti-American.
That was former combat veteran, West Point graduate, Danny Sjursen.